Okay, I'm back for part three. Had a couple meetings, but now I'm going to finish this lecture, and then you guys can watch all three of these exciting lectures and then take the quiz. So the last physiographic region I'm going to talk about is really, it's not in the list of physiographic regions I showed you earlier, and really is not a physiographic region of its own. It's just an ecoregion. But it's really important for the eastern US, and so I thought I would cover it here. And so the area I'm talking about is the lower Mississippi riverine forest. And so on this map that's in the bottom right corner of the slide, you can see this kind of bluish area here. That's the ecoregion we're talking about. And it's really just kind of the drainage of the Mississippi River, capturing like so many other tributaries to the Mississippi and then dumping into the Gulf Coast. So this region is characterized by low elevation and flat landscapes. So we're getting toward the end of the Mississippi River, so we're really low elevation and not a lot of topography. These are generally consist of floodplains and these fluvial terraces. So this is just a cross section here of what this kind of looks like. You would have your stream and then a couple steps, if you will, moving up from the river. And so you'd have your floodplain and your more upland areas. And so we have different vegetation types as you move from the stream outward and kind of up those terraces. And so we'll just talk about those briefly. Because we're talking about this kind of southern part of the US and the end, if you will, of the Mississippi River. We're talking about places that are relatively warm, and so cold temperatures aren't limiting growth very much in this area. But what you do see is that we have a dry period during the summer months. However, we're really just talking about almost all riparian areas, or certainly forested areas near the river, and so this water limitation isn't as big of a consideration for this region as some others. So thinking about the vegetation, what we generally have is the oak, like a gum cypress or oak gum cypress that's kind of in that river floodplain. And then as you're moving up those terraces, you're kind of moving to vegetation types that are less flood tolerant. So your elm, ash, cottonwood is not as flood tolerant as the oak gum cypress. And so that's a little bit further up. And then once you get to the uplands where we don't have flooding, we transition back into those oak hickory forests, which dominate much of this western part of the eastern US that we're talking about. So those are our three dominant forest cover types in this particular region. And the reason I talked about this ecoregion is just because of its importance to kind of the health of the Mississippi River, as well as the Gulf Coast, or the Gulf in general. These forests that are comprised of the oak gum cypress, the elm ash cottonwood, and the oak hickory, those forests are really important in mitigating the effects of flooding. And so with those forests removed, we see a lot more kind of negative impacts of flooding in the region. And as you might imagine, lots of those forests have been cleared over the last century or so to clear areas for agriculture. The other thing that's happened is because those forests are gone and there's lots of agriculture in the area, the nutrients that have been added to agricultural systems get into the river much more quickly. If those forests were there, they take up a lot of those nutrients and kind of help mitigate the impacts of that runoff. And then lastly, sediment loads in the streams. Those forests and the roots of those forests help stabilize the soil so that when there is flooding, less of that sediment gets into the river. And when there's just general runoff from the area, less of those sediments get into the river. And so when you remove those forests, more sediment gets into those streams and the rivers and changes the conditions in the rivers, and then has a big impact on those ecosystems. So these are kind of like three really vital kind of functions that these forests perform for the Mississippi River. And again, lots of them have been removed over the last century or so, and so we've seen some negative impacts of the flooding, the nutrient loading in those rivers, and the sediment loading. And so, oh, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Management of this area, so you can see that lots of this area has been converted to agriculture. You can see it goes well back beyond the last 100 years or so. Um, let's see, 80% of original wetland forests have been converted to agriculture, so huge parts of that have changed. We also have lots of urban development in that area, and so its effect on flood control and nitrogen inputs, is affecting not only the ecosystems now, but that human dimension as well. So there's lots of restoration efforts going on in this region, and so they're trying to reestablish those soils and those forests. As you can imagine, though, since those forests have been gone for a long time, the soils and the soil conditions and the hydrology have changed a lot. And so getting those to reestablish and grow again has been a definite challenge in that particular region. And I probably should have put this picture before, but this is one of the impacts and kind of downstream effects of removing those forests. So so in this area here is that kind of lower Mississippi riverine area. Because those forests have been removed, as I mentioned, lots more nutrients get into the river, and then they get dumped into the Gulf Coast. Those extra nutrients cause these algal blooms in the Gulf, and then have big impacts on the fish in particular and other marine wildlife that are in those areas. So you can these are a couple pictures from large algal blooms that have taken place. There's a similar situation in parts of China where they're seeing these large algal blooms. When the algae grow, it basically consumes all the oxygen in the water. And so actually what you're seeing in this map is oxygen concentrations being really low near where the Mississippi dumps into the Gulf, and then slowly getting higher and higher concentrations. And so as those oxygen concentrations go down, then the fish tend to die. So really important ecosystem, and the forests in those areas in particular are super important, even though it represents a fairly small percentage of the land area in the eastern US. Okay, let's talk about more broadly some of the management considerations in the eastern US. So especially as we're thinking about the more northern forests, so we're talking kind of that New England, St. Lawrence Valley area, Adirondacks, and then over into northern Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota areas in particular. There's a lot less urban development in those areas. And so lots of those forests are like still intact and provide a lot of logging and recreation throughout much of the eastern US. So just as an example, Wisconsin and Minnesota's forest products here are listed, just a fairly large amount of forest products. So people are relying on those forests for those kind of products. Also, these forests sequester about 15% of US carbon emissions. So for the US in particular, like these forests are really important from a carbon budget standpoint. Lots of these forests are in what we would call that transitional forest, where it's transitioning from eastern deciduous to boreal forest. And so what's happening right now is that boundary between the boreal and the eastern deciduous is kind of moving north or moving up in elevation. And so we're seeing that the spruce and fir seedlings that get established, they don't usually survive very long in those forests, and then they're being replaced by deciduous forests, especially like maple, beech, and birch trees. And so we're seeing a big transition from the areas that used to be boreal forests are kind of getting pushed further and further north. And so from a manager's perspective, they're kind of grappling with these questions of, do we try to keep it a boreal forest as long as possible? Do we actually assist the migration of the eastern deciduous forests? What should be our role in this transition? And so it's a big topic that's going on, especially in the northern part of eastern US. Kind of throughout this whole area, partly because the population is much more dense in the eastern US than large parts of the western US. There's been a lot of conversion of these forests to agricultural lands. And, for much of this area, the soils are pretty good and the weather conditions are good for agriculture. And so a lot of those forests have been removed and replaced by agriculture. Also, we have lots of habitat fragmentation. So this map that's shown here, this is a road map of Arkansas. And I put this one up there because growing up in southern Michigan and thinking about, dreaming about going on road trips and seeing other parts of the country, like I always kind of chuckled when I saw the map of Arkansas because the number of roads in that state are just always struck me as being kind of ridiculously dense. But really, this is the situation across all of the eastern U.S. And so we've got roads everywhere, so we don't have large areas of continuous forest anymore. We've got huge habitat fragmentation. So all the issues that come with fragmenting a habitat are applying to the eastern U.S. forests. And then lastly, fire. What to do about using fire in management. So this is something that everybody really seems to be tackling with no matter where you're at, whether you're a grassland ecologist or a forest ecologist. Like, fire is an important aspect of the ecosystem and shaping that ecosystem, but it's really hard to utilize that as a tool because of the population density in the United States and trying to keep everybody safe. So that's a big question about kind of what to do about fire. You had access to a couple of these maps when you were thinking about kind of the climate and the disturbance patterns associated with different forest cover types. And so this is actually the whole figure that I pulled those panels from. So what we have here is on the top two panels, so A and B, are the different forest cover types. So this is in the past, and this is current. And right now I can't remember the dates, but I believe the past was pre-1950s, but it might have been a little bit older, and then current is more from like 80s to today. But you can just see, looking at the color patterns, how drastically different the forest cover types are. So there used to be a lot of oak hickory in that western part of the US, and lots of oak pine, so that brown and that kind of mustard yellow. And if you switch over to current, you don't see near as much of that forest cover type anymore. It's been replaced in large part by oak mesic hardwoods, which in this case, and some of those northern hardwoods as well. And in that case, we're really talking about a lot more maples being present in the forest now than they were historically. And that's because in large part, because our fire regimes have changed. So the bottom two panels, the one on the left shows the past fire regime, and the right shows the current fire regime. And I'm not going to go into all the different categories, but the different categories represent the frequency and intensity of fires. But what you can see is we're missing a lot of those kind of class 1 and class 2 fires, which would be the tans and the reds. Right now, we don't have those kinds of fires. We have group 3s and group 4s, fires. And so that's less frequent fires, essentially, is what's happening. And so because we have fewer fires, the species that are not as fire tolerant are able to outcompete those ones that are more fire tolerant. So maples are pretty intolerant of fire, and so if you've got a system where fire is a large part of that system, you're probably not going to have any maples, beeches, and birches. But if you remove fire, then those species usually can grow faster than the oaks and hickories and outcompete them. And so that's one of the biggest changes we're seeing in the eastern US. Okay, so that's all for the slides for this week. There will be a quiz posted, and so you can take that quiz along with going through these slides.